Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. I'm Avery Davis Roberts, Associate Director of the Carter Center's Democracy Program, and I'm very pleased to welcome you on behalf of the Carter Center and the Election Reformers Network to this afternoon's conversation on how we can take partisanship out of election administration. This conversation could not be more timely. Just yesterday, the New York Times ran an article on, and I quote, brazenly partisan candidates who were now campaigning to oversee elections while denying the last one. When the Carter Center works internationally, we see that there are many models used to provide impartial and independent oversight of elections, almost all of which do not include electing partisan election officials. But what are some of the good practices or models that we could use here in the United States, maybe building on experiences we have in other sectors or other aspects of the election process that could help us imagine different ways of approaching this issue? That is what we are here to talk about today. And we know, given the depth and breadth of election expertise within the audience, that this is going to be a great conversation. I'd like to note that with this conversation, we are also launching a new report published by the Carter Center and ERN, written by panelist Kevin Johnson, on new models for keeping partisans out of election administration. This paper goes deeper on some of the points we'll discuss today, so we really hope that you will enjoy it. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our moderator, Tia Mitchell. Tia is the Washington, D.C. correspondent for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Prior to joining the paper in 2017, Tia spent her entire career in Florida, covering local and state government for publications like the Tampa Bay Times and the Florida Times-Union. I'm sure it was an adventure, and we'll hear about some of that. And she currently serves as the National Association of Black Journalists Political Task Force Chair. Tia, thank you so much for being here with us today. Over to you.
Thank you guys so much for having me, and I'm looking forward to our conversation today. A lot of people are very concerned about our democracy and how growing partisanship is putting our election system at risk. So today, you're going to hear about some ideas that could help. And as already has been mentioned, we have a great panel put together to talk about practical reforms that can make sure that people running elections are impartial and independent. And with that, I am going to introduce our panelists. And our panelists can just wave. First, we have Miles Rapoport. He is the former Secretary of State of Connecticut, the former president of Common Cause, and senior practice fellow at the Ash Center of Harvard's Kennedy School. Nick Stephanopoulos is the Kirkland and Ellis Professor of Law at Harvard Law School, and he is also a leading scholar on redistricting. Kevin Johnson is founder of Election Reformers Network and senior advisor to the Carter Center. Kevin is also the author of that new report you heard about called New Methods for Keeping Partisanship Out of Election Administration, and we'll be touching on that a lot today. And joining us is Amber McReynolds, former director of elections for the city of Denver. She is also founding CEO of the National Vote at Home Institute, and she also serves as a board member or advisor to a wide range of prominent election-related organizations. So thank you so much to our panelists for joining us. And we're going to get right to it. In addition, there will be time a little bit later to answer your questions in the audience. So please use the Q&A function to submit any questions you have. We do have a lot of people participating, so we'll try to get to as many questions as we can. But at any time, you can start whenever it moves you to use the Q&A function to submit your own questions. All right, so we're going to start by, getting to the problem at hand. We have talked about the news reports that a lot of Stop the Steal people who are loyal to former President Trump are running for Secretary of State in various states, including Atlanta, where I report on, the state of Georgia, and also organizing to take key local election positions. So how much of a problem is that? Amber, I'd like to start with you. Can you talk a little bit about partisan political pressures on local elected officials and maybe why that requires a need to rethink governance?
Yeah, well, it's great to be here, and thank you so much for inviting me to the Election Verification Election Reformers Network and the Carter Center. I think first and foremost, and as someone who ran elections for a long period of time, election officials across the country are very much the guardians of democracy, and they have faced attacks and threats, whether that be related to the voting system or just the big lie generally about the election itself. And I think that we've sort of seen this culmination after 2020 where election officials have been targeted, but it also highlights a larger need to ensure that we protect election officials in the line of duty and how they're approaching their work, but also think about the potential for insider threat issues, partisanship, and we've seen how politicized the election process has become. So whatever we can do to continue to make sure the guardrails and the governance structures are in place at the federal, state, and local level to ensure election officials are able to operate and do their jobs in the way that that is outlined in each state's laws and also at the federal level, and make sure that there's those protections for them when they're trying to do that. All of those questions and policy considerations are on the table right now, especially given the lessons we've learned from the 2020 election cycle and the continued attacks on election officials across the country.
So, Miles, what's changed since your time as Secretary of State? And do you think things have gotten worse, or is it just more attention on, I guess, the partisan pressures when you hold these positions?
I think the real answer to that question is yes and yes, Tia. In the sense that, I was Secretary of the State for Connecticut. I was elected in 1994 and served for 4 years. And that was just at the beginning of, kind of the more stringent partisanship at that time. And I think things have gotten much worse since then. I think people are looking at the, kind of ascension or an attempted ascension to key positions of election administration by people who are have very clearly denied that the last election was held in a proper way, and are vowing really to say we are going to make sure that the elections come our way coming forward. But even in the situation where that were not the case, even in what one might call more normal times, although I'm not sure what we're entering into a new normal and we won't know what it is for a while. A Secretary of the State who is a partisan elected official is under immense pressure to, work on behalf of the party and on behalf of the other candidates of the party. Many Secretaries of State do make endorsements in other races, and I do think that puts pressure on them in terms of deciding in close races on recount issues, et cetera. Secretaries can be threatened by their own parties with political retribution, and obviously even legal retribution or physical retribution. And I think that we're seeing more and more of that. So I really think that we ought to take the lessons from other countries and from the report and do whatever we can to shield both secretaries of the state, if they are the chief election official at the state level, and more localized county and local election officials from those kind of partisan pressures. And I think the report outlines some good ways to do that.
Got it. Well, thank you so much. So, okay, Nick, you just had this big report come out. How do you see these problems in the context of the broader issues of conflict of interest in elections that you focus on?
Yeah, I think the report exemplifies what I think is the key underlying fundamental point here, which is that it's genuinely problematic when you have self-interested partisan politicians responsible for an activity like running and administering elections. If we think about who secretaries of state are, they're typically politicians, they're typically partisans, They're typically not experts in election administration. They have to raise money, they have to campaign for office. Very often they have ambitions for other offices that are totally unrelated to running elections. And so if you put all of those dynamics and those incentives together, you have a recipe for bad, biased, non-objective election administration. I was watching football yesterday, and so a sports analogy comes to mind. It's obvious that in sports we have referees who are distinct from the teams themselves that are competing. It would be preposterous to have a Super Bowl where the referee was a member of the Rams or a supporter of the Rams or the Bengals. But that's the dynamic that we typically accept when it comes to administering elections. We allow the chief election official for a state to be someone with a rooting interest, not somebody whose primary commitment is to excellent, impartial election administration. And there's something, America has done things this way for a long time, and so there's sometimes a sense that this is inevitable. If not for politicians, who else could administer elections? But if we look at how other Western advanced democracies run their elections, basically nobody does it this way. To our north, there's the Elections Canada Federal Electoral Commission that runs Canadian elections. Australia, where my wife is from, has the Australian Electoral Commission. The UK has a central electoral commission as well. And the key point about all these bodies is that they're expert, non-political, experienced administrators of elections. They don't run for those positions. They build up vast amounts of knowledge by running elections over years. They're simply not subject to the same political and partisan pressures as elected officials. And so I think that, if we're starting from first principles, the obvious problem here is the potential partisanship and self-interest of secretaries of state. And the obvious solution globally is to take politics out of this position by turning it into essentially an expert bureaucratic position.
So Kevin, I'm going to bring you in. Do you agree with this, what Nick is saying about kind of creating nonpartisan elected officials? And if so, how do we do that in America, where you have 50 states with 50 different ways of doing it? And then most states, they're each municipality, each county, or, there are all these different election systems, hundreds in America. So can this even be accomplished?
Thanks, Tia. That's a great question. And just to answer your first question, I definitely agree with what the prior panelists have said, and would agree and extend further in some respects. I mean, Nick mentioned, international models that work, and one of the things we've been focusing on in our work is, well, what are models here in the U.S.? What are the state institutions that already do the job of performing partisan or performing tasks that are politically important, but doing so in a way that parties can't control? And we focused on two, which really are the key things we talk about in this report. One is the independent redistricting commissions that have done a great job doing redistricting separate from legislative control. And other panelists will speak much better to that than I can. The second is the systems in place in many states for selecting judges. And it's interesting to note that a lot of states no longer use elections for electing judges for many of the kind of points that others have mentioned. There's a conflict of interest that gets created. It turns out that a lot of the money that goes in for campaign financing in judicial elections comes from corporations and individuals with interest before the court. So back in the 40s, an alternative approach was initiated called merit-based selection. And that basically means getting people together, getting a group of people together who have the expertise to figure out who are the best judges qualified for the openings. These, the groups that do this are called judicial nominating commissions. They're designed and established in constitutions to be broadly representative. Often many of the members are appointed by state bar associations who, are in the business of having the professional expertise of qualifying people for legal practice. These commissions name 2 or 3 approved candidates. They submit that shortlist to the judge, and the judge picks from that to appoint state Supreme Court justices and other judges. That exact model can really transfer very well to election administration, is one of the things we argue in this report. We encourage states to think about a state election official nominating commission that could vet the best qualified candidates for Secretary of State or for Chief Election Officer in states where that's not the Secretary of State, or for seats on state election boards, and even for some local election posts. In the report, we kind of draft out a model version of how it could work. We have a 7-member commission with 2 members representing the 2 parties selected in the legislature, a retired judge, 2 members representing local election officials, 1 urban, 1 rural, representatives of third parties, independent voters, civil society, etc. Put together, who are the stakeholders, how do you represent them? There are a lot of states can choose different ways to do this, of course, but the point being, we have successful models that we can leverage to put people in authority who are independent professionals who can do the job. And it's up to the states to sort of begin that experimentation in those laboratories of democracy.
I want to bring Miles and Amber back in. What models do you all think gets close to getting it right when it comes to trying to remove partisanship from election administration? Or do you think in America, most models are mostly problematic? Miles, you're on mute.
Amber, go ahead. Why don't you go first?
Well, I think first and foremost, we have to think about the 3 levels, so federal, state, local. So, all of these kind of have to work together. In some states, it's an elected Secretary of State, others it's the Lieutenant Governor, others it's State Board of Elections. So all these models are different, and there's been modifications over time. And one of the most recent large modifications was in Kentucky, where there was more separation of the Secretary of State's power from the State Board of Elections, and that was restructured. So I think sort of looking at all of these things and then considering the local, state, and federal impact and what the guardrails are around it all means that we have to think about it together. I think the other aspect of this, which I think cannot be ignored, is the fact that a lot of these state officials, secretaries mostly, are constitutional offices, and they also have advantages for the 2 major political parties to win those races, and they're seen as stepping stones. And so the incentives that are built in within the state structure for running for those positions sort of incentivize one of the 2 major parties to essentially come out on top, and then that's why it's become a stepping stone in a large way. So I don't think there's a perfect model from what I have seen, but I think there are examples of where we can cobble together different models that potentially would be better than the current. And then I think there's also a way that we think about how we add to the ethical guardrails and some of the other provisions around each of the offices to potentially achieve a more transparent and better election administration.
I would say it's interesting. I think it would be a real mistake to kind of throw our hands up and say, well, you can never take politics out of elections, and so let's don't even try. I think the experience that we have with the nonpartisan redistricting commissions, independent redistricting commissions, is quite good. We've learned some lessons about what really works, but I think the idea of creating an independent commission that has representation from the parties but cannot be controlled by the parties, that has specific criteria by which they have to operate, it really has worked. And there are a number of states that have had much better redistricting processes, even so far, than they did in 2011. So I do think that, and there are a variety of mechanisms that have have been done on the redistricting commissions. Some are better than others, and I think the more we can, as the report suggests, have input from the parties, so that it's not like they're not completely denied or deprived of being part of the process, but not have the kind of veto power that they have in so many states, I think would really help. It's interesting. I was a partisan Secretary of the State. I do think it's important to say that most secretaries of the state up through now have done really, really good jobs. Some of them resisting tremendous pressure in the 2020 election. So, I don't think it's like a horrible situation now, but I think we can make really major improvements. And I think the report points us in some directions that I think can be really helpful.
Nick, I wanted you to talk a little bit more about what independent redistricting commissions have achieved, and can you help make the connection? I know we've been talking about it, but as a layperson on this topic, how do you apply that model to election administration? What does that look like?
Yeah, great. And, so Miles mentioned redistricting already, and I do think it's a promising model. So redistricting raises a lot of the same questions as administering elections. You have an activity that could be done sort of impartially and for the public interest, but it also has great potential to be distorted for the sake of partisan advantage. And so there's the exact same tension where if you allow partisans to do redistricting, they're strongly incentivized to put their thumb on the scale and draw districts in a way that benefits their side. If you take out that motive, you all of a sudden create the possibility for district maps that are more fair, that achieve other values like competitiveness, minority representation, keeping different communities together, and so on. So how have American commissions been structured to take out politics? There are 3 or sort of 4 options. The sort of 4th option I'm going to start with is having a commission, but a commission composed of partisan elected officials. And that's basically a non-model, because if you have a multi-member commission, but it's filled with elected officials who are partisans, it'll behave the same way as the legislature or as a single elected official. And that's what we see when the Ohio Commission, which is made up of partisans, districts, it gerrymanders in exactly the same way that elected state legislators do as well. A second model, the oldest model, is the bipartisan redistricting commission model. States like Washington, New Jersey, and others use this model. Here, the idea is to allow each party to appoint some number of commissioners. So then you have 4 Democrats and 4 Republicans, for example, on the commission. And then you typically allow the partisans together to select a chair who also functions as the tiebreaker for the commission. And so that model is better because the ultimate decision maker is somebody who's not a pure partisan and somebody who's acceptable to both sides because they've come together to select that person as the ultimate tiebreaker. Another model, the model most like the one used by foreign countries, is a sort of bureaucratic redistricting commission. In the US, Iowa is the only state that really does this. There's an agency within the legislative branch that's responsible for redistricting. It doesn't have final power over redistricting, but in practice, in recent decades, its maps have never been overturned by the legislature. And the bureaucrats who are part of this little agency, they have a lot of expertise, a lot of experience, and the maps they draw are well known for their competitiveness, for their compactness, and so on. And the final model you might think of as more of a citizen jury commission. This is the model now used by California and Michigan. It's also the model that was proposed at the federal level and passed by the US House earlier in 2021 as part of the HR1 omnibus election reform bill. And so here the idea is to have regular citizens apply to be members of the commission. They're then screened based on their qualifications. And then, like with the jury, there's a lottery to select who the final members of the commission will be, with some constraints like a sufficient number of independents, a sufficient number of people affiliating with each major party as well. And so in terms of results, I've done some work showing that historically, independent commissions did a bit better, but not drastically better than politicians in terms of the partisan fairness of the maps they drew. In this cycle, now that there's more attention than ever on quantitative measures of partisan fairness, the record of the commissions this cycle appears to be absolutely outstanding. I saw a report just the other day showing the predicted partisan biases of all of the congressional maps drawn so far. And you basically have all the Democratic drawn maps predicted to have large pro-Democratic biases, all the Republican drawn maps expected to have large pro-Republican biases, and right in the middle are all half a dozen or so so far of the commission drawn congressional maps with predicted biases quite close to perfect fairness. So I'm quite confident that this cycle commissions will compile their best record to date in terms of promoting partisan fairness. Now, is this model transferable to the election administration space? I think so. You know, structurally, there's no reason why we can't have a bipartisan, a partisan, a jury, or a bureaucratic commission that's responsible for running elections. The main difference between all of these models and the current Secretary of State model is whether you have a single official running elections or a multi-member body. But I think in principle and in practice, there's no obstacle to having a multi-member body responsible for running elections. You know, you would just have collegial decision-making instead of decision-making by a single individual. And certainly, redistricting is very complex, just like election administration is very complex, and it's been feasible in the redistricting space. Last thing I'll say here is that we do have at least one American example of something like a bureaucratic commission working quite well for election administration. This is Wisconsin's Government Accountability Board, which was disbanded a few years ago, but it was in existence for about a decade. It was composed of retired judges who were screened by Wisconsin's active judges first, and then nominated by the governor and confirmed by the Wisconsin Senate. And for the better part of a decade, the GAB was considered to be one of the finest, if not the finest, election administrator in the country. You know, the Republicans in Wisconsin eventually dismantled the GAB because they wanted to have greater political influence over election administration. But you know, that just tells us that the parties might often be dissatisfied with models that try to depoliticize election administration. It doesn't tell us not to depoliticize election administration. And so in Wisconsin, we have a homegrown illustration of what something like a multi-member independent administrative body might look like in the election administration space.
Okay, well, thank you. And now, okay, I'm going to ask all of you guys this, but I want to start with Kevin, and you guys keep it brief because we want to get to some of these questions I'm seeing in the Q&A chat, but this is actually one of them. Do you think that as an incremental change or as a first change, it's as easy as electing secretaries of state on a nonpartisan basis? Could that help address the issue? Why or why not? And we'll start with you, Kevin.
Yeah, it's a good question. And I'm actually going to expand it a little bit because I think we should think about transitioning from partisan election to nonpartisan election, both at the local level and at the state level. Right now, and this goes back to Tia, your part of your question I didn't really answer before, but there's a lot of complexity, of course, in U.S. local election administration, and we have some jurisdictions where the person in charge is elected in partisan elections and some where that person is elected in nonpartisan elections. And I think there in particular, there really is no particular reason why, you know, there should be an R or a D label on the person running for the clerk who's going to manage elections and other functions. So I think in general, that can be a very good place for the sort of symbolic aspect, if nothing else, that I think Julie mentioned in the question. At the state side, it becomes more complicated. And I think the issue is that when you take labels off of elections, or even if you do take the labels off of elections, if the election is really competitive, and if you know, there's a lot of money involved, there's a lot of campaign fundraising involved, political insiders have a natural advantage. And it's very hard to get the professional experts to win in that context. So to fully answer the question, yes, I think this can be part of the mix in the set of solutions, and polls show voters like it, but there needs to be some guardrails to help avoid some of those problems I mentioned. And there are three particular guardrails. The first is some kind of public campaign financing elements, whether voluntary or how to do it, but that reduces the advantage of political insiders. The second is some kind of voting system that prevents, you know, 6 candidates all running without a primary and the winner wins with 25%, which is not going to, you know, be a system likely to get a good person in charge. And then the third is prohibitions against that Secretary of State running for higher office while in office, or maybe even for a couple of years after, because the goal here really is to make the office not a stepping stone for a political career. If we make it a destination for election specialists, you know, that can achieve a lot. So we sort of need to add that in for nonpartisan elections to achieve that. But interested to hear what others have to say. Sorry it took so long.
Anybody else want to weigh in on nonpartisan election heads?
Sure.
Yeah, I would just
Go ahead, Amber.
Well, I would just add in that I think it is a potential good incremental step. Again, I think it works in context of the greater governance restructure, or the way that we think about governance broadly. Under the Help America Vote Act, that's what designates the chief election official authority to, whether it be the Secretary of State or the Board of Elections in the respective state. So more guardrails just around ethical responsibilities could also be an incremental step as states consider these pieces. But I have been a believer for a long time that I think moving to a nonpartisan elected model could be a great first step. There are examples of that at the local level, could be applied to the state. And then again, considering other ethical standards or guardrails, such as one that's come up quite a bit in Colorado, which is if a Secretary of State, for instance, is going to run for higher office, not just their own office, but run for higher office, potentially putting a provision in place that they'd have to resign their office or step away in some way to prevent sort of that interference that can be that can look bad in an election cycle. So I think there's a lot of incremental steps that could be taken as we think about broader government structural change.
Yeah, I was interested in Kevin's kind of qualifications for when this would work. And I think they're actually generalizable to elections themselves, no matter what the office. Some sort of a public financing system, you know, and a voting system where it's either ranked choice voting or whether you make sure that somebody has to win by a majority. And I would obviously add also that the, you know, mechanisms to ensure the highest possible voter turnout. You know, I think that I like Amber's point about introducing some guardrails as initial steps of requiring the Secretary of the State to recuse themselves from elections in which they have a personal stake. I think that's a you know, relatively easy step. I think that there are ways of you know, enforcing that. I think a set of criteria by the legislature and on other aspects as well, I think would be good. I do it's interesting. A number of the secretaries of the states are not elected. They are appointed either by the legislature or by the governor in many states. And there, I think you have a perfect example of where the recommendations of the report about a judicial, taken from the Judicial Nominating Commission model would be really, really interesting if you had secretaries of state who, in order to be appointed to that position, had to go through a kind of a nonpartisan and more collective process. I do think, I would say this, and I have resisted this in my own mind for a long time, but I think as we are watching what is happening, the idea of taking the Secretary of State's position from an elected position, which is, as I say, what I was and which many are doing very well at, and making it into an appointed position, either as a Secretary of the State singularly or as part of a board, with the kind of guardrails and qualifications that the report suggests, I think is going to be the best answer that we can come up with in a situation where we are in such a hyper-polarized time that it just becomes harder and harder and harder for an individual elected election official to do their job and do it well.
So I see a question in the Q&A that really addresses one of the elephants in the room and something I've been writing a lot about. And the question is, all these things we've been talking about, we know that states have been resistant, particularly conservative states, but Democrats too sometimes resist taking partisanship out of election administration when they control things. The question I'll start, because I think, we're going to try to get as many questions in the Q&A. Let's start with you, Amber. Do you think a lot of these proposals are going to require a federal solution to create some national standards? That's my question.
I think potentially. So, I mean, when we think about elections, we have to think about that there's a federal role, and there's been many examples of bipartisan legislation, and there are federal baseline standards for various parts of the election process, and then similarly the state and then the local. So I think it's important that we have to continue to think about the governance of elections in this holistic fashion, and look at how all of those pieces work together. I do think that certainly from an ethical perspective, as we think about standards, an incremental change could be contemplating other things that have happened at the federal level, whether that be the Hatch Act and requirements for government officials in that way, and thinking about a more broad structure across the country that respects state laws, but also has federal standards. That could be another opportunity. But I just think we have to think about this globally, and in a sense that there are three different dimensions of this. And we have to continue to look at that, because the states do govern a lot of this, but there are many examples of federal laws and baselines in place. And I think this could certainly be another example. And this also, elections were designated as critical infrastructure post 2016. So in the last 6 years, this has all come about. So this is also a security consideration that we have to think about. And that's why it should be part of a federal dynamic conversation, considering all of these factors.
All right, here's another one. Let's see here. I'm going to throw this one out to Miles. The question I want you to answer is from our Q&A box. A typical critique of nonpartisan election administration is that it reduces accountability. So how do you respond to that some of the things that you guys are suggesting will reduce accountability for the people in that role?
It's an interesting question. And I think the definition of accountability is a tricky one these days. I mean, I think we would have to say that on the one hand, in a theoretical way, having a Secretary of the State or other key election official have to be accountable to voters and be reelected is a theoretically attractive proposition. But I think you would also have to say that in the real world that we are living in, the definition of accountability is very often accountability to one's own party or to the higher levels of elected officials in the state. And so I think that the need for protection from the partisan pressures, in my mind at this point, outweighs the benefits of being accountable in some theoretical way to the voters, in particular in the absence of the kind of campaign finance reforms that Kevin was talking about before. So I would say we're not being very well served by the kind of accountability that we're seeing for election officials, and the ones that have done the best job are the ones who have been shielded from it as much as we can. I would also say that going back to the question on the federal, whether this could be done at the federal level, I honestly think that most of the major structural changes at the state level to the Office of Secretary of State, which is mainly a constitutional office, or other things, are going to be done by the citizens of those states themselves. The independent redistricting commissions that we've seen have mostly, not entirely, but mostly been created through ballot initiatives by citizens, which are wildly popular once people get a chance to look at them. So I think probably the citizens of the state are essential for changing the dynamics in the state. And I think that on the accountability question, the partisanship issue is just too strong nowadays.
Can I chime in on the possibility of federal intervention here? So, there are all sorts of political reasons why federal intervention might be quite implausible, right? We have no tradition of the federal government directing states and localities how to administer their elections. So it might be politically off the table. Legally, though, there is very likely an awful lot that the federal government, in theory, could do. So with respect to federal elections, the federal government's authority is essentially plenary. States only run congressional elections because they've been implicitly delegated that authority by the federal government. There is zero state or federal constitutional support for any kind of exclusive state authority over congressional elections. So if Congress wanted every state to have a nonpartisan commission responsible for running elections, Congress could pass that bill. The House did pass that bill, as I mentioned before, with respect to independent congressional redistricting. And from a legal perspective, there is no difference between redistricting and election administration. Both are tasks that states have historically run, but they're not tasks that only states can run. And so if Congress wanted to disrupt the status quo here, Congress absolutely could.
So we also had a question, and thank you for that, because I think that's a good point about the fact that the way our Congress has more control if they take it back. So Kevin, I want to go back to you. We have a question about, down at the local, we have a lot of questions about partisanship at the very local level, but this one says, most election precincts have to be staffed with the party balance between Republican and Democrat officials. So they want you to address the precinct officials that operate individual precincts and how you can try to take partisanship or, reduce partisanship at that local level.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I don't think that observation is, a reason why these ideas can't advance over time all the way to the local level. I mean, I think there's some context that's really interesting to look at. And first of all, no other country really does this. You don't have this sort of, well, we'll take the two parties and make them run elections in the polling stations, partly because there's no country that sort of legally enshrines two parties the way we do. And we should recognize there's a lot of concern about the quote unquote duopoly and how this sort of status of the duopoly is kind of a, these two parties as the empowered in a sense, prevents the evolution of new parties. And the election structure and the way parties at the local level are given these board seats and as well as precinct level roles is in a sense a part of that. I think I'm really looking for the research on the history of this, and I hope someone writes it or sends it to me. But my guess is that the structures we have were in a sense a reform over an even worse structure, which was machine party control. I mean, you think of, the cities at the turn of the century, or you think of Jim Crow, all these things were sort of run by the one party that controlled the state. And so reformers in the progressive era, I believe, were able to make an improvement on that. Let's say we need R's and D's in those polling stations. We need R's and D's on local boards. We need R's and D's in county canvassing. Well, look what happened in Michigan when we had where with their 2 R's and 2 D's. One of the D's said, no, I'm not going to certify that result. What if one of the R's said, I'm not going to certify the result. What if 2 of them had? What if you're starting to get the risk of gridlock from this system that relies on R's and D's? And I think the structure was, in a sense, built on the assumption that there would be no other source of citizens who cared enough about elections to play those roles. And this is another of the great learnings of the redistricting commissions. There were tens of thousands of citizen applicants for the commission in California and Michigan. Citizens really care and they're willing to step forward. There is no reason to take only citizens who affiliate and align with one party or the other. It's going to take a lot of work and structuring to make it fit in different locations, but there shouldn't be a principle that says all this local stuff has to be R&D based.
Amber, I want to bring you back in. We have a kind of question comment that points out that in a lot of other countries, there's a distinction between a board that makes the policy and then the individual executive who's supposed to implement the policies. And so I think about the states that I've worked in, mainly Florida and Georgia. And Georgia has an election board, but there's that push and pull with the Secretary of State role and what powers should be allowed with the executive and what power should be at the state board. So the question is, the question I want to ask you is, what's the right balance? Do you think it's better to have a strong board and the executive just carry out the policy, or should the Secretary of State or whatever that role is still have some of its own autonomy?
So I think first and foremost, and it's a great question, and I also appreciate all the comments that are in the chat about some of this, but the structure and how we think about this, and we have to think about what incentives we're building into the system, because right now in a lot of the states where it's an elected secretary that gets often chosen through a closed primary or even a caucus process, and sometimes that's even the local election officials too, we've disincentivized independence and we've even cut them out of the process, but we've disincentivized the people that look at it as a technical job, as an administrative job, that want to run it in a nonpartisan way, and becomes this sort of party position. And so we have to, I think, rethink the incentives as a first step. The second piece is, I actually think that, thinking about these states that have a Secretary of State that's elected, along with some sort of board structure, Kentucky and Georgia both come to mind. Georgia made some changes recently. The boards are really designed to be kind of an accountability mechanism for the secretary, or in Kentucky's case, they have distinct roles. So it's sort of an interesting model to think about on whether or not it adds to the accountability or incentivizes the correct behavior. But I sort of also just go back for a second to, we want these offices, the people, the chief election officials, the designated election officials, either at the local, state, or even federal level, to be running a process that's customer focused, that's focused on the technical aspects, the administrative aspects, that largely stays out of the partisan politicization process that is unnecessary and also counterproductive to the mission of the organization. And one of the other models that I will just throw out there that's been in existence since the founding of our country is also the structure, for instance, and this is just one example, but when you think about the United States Postal Service, it's an independent quasi-governmental entity that's been around for more than 250 years. It is separate from the executive branch. It is separate from the judicial. It's separate from Congress. Still has a policy component, but operates independently. And I think we have to kind of be a lot more creative than what we have been to think about these solutions in the United States. Now, I think that kind of model could be an option for a federal, entity that has a role in supporting elections, and then think about state and locals and leave that up to the states and try to provide guardrails and best practices. But again, all these pieces fit together. And I do think we have to be far more creative than we have been so far, largely because we've seen issues, but also because we have a changing electorate. And a couple people have pointed out that independents have grown significantly over the last 10 years and make up more than 45% of the country, and yet are largely left out of being election judges, running for office, running for Secretary of State, running for these positions. So I think we have to think about it just in a very holistic way, and how all these pieces fit together, and be very creative. Independent redistricting commissions, judicial selection processes, and also other structures that maybe we haven't been part of the conversation so far.
All right, we're going to we got a couple more minutes before we need to wrap up. So we're going to do some rapid fire questions. Miles, quickly, I want to ask you, how important is funding and having the right equipment? We've talked a lot about, policy, but that practical side of running elections, how important is that? Just kind of a quick answer.
You're muted, Miles, sorry.
Quick answer, funding is incredibly important. I think that the chronic underfunding of the elections process has been a real problem over time. And I think even in the 2020 election, you had a situation in which Congress appropriated some money for changes to accommodate COVID, and then failed to appropriate any more. And then you had people coming in from the private sector putting money in, and now some of the legislation is attempting to block that. I think if our democracy is a critical function of our country, then it needs the kind of fund. So yes, I think funding is incredibly important, and we ought to make sure that we get it.
And I'm going to send the last question to you, Nick. We had a question about, we've talked a lot about independent panels and things like that, but have lobbyists or partisan interests still been able to have an oversized influence on these independent commissions, or have they managed to resist that pressure and stay neutral? And how do you even assess whether that's happening? And I know it's a little bit complicated, but as quickly as you can answer it.
Yeah, great. So partisans have certainly tried to influence these commissions. There are all sorts of reports of partisans organizing testimony at hearings, partisans trying to submit their preferred maps, either overtly or undercover through some sort of other vehicle. So parties will attempt to influence any other actor that has sway over matters that affect the parties. I think the proof is in the pudding, though. We have quantitative measures that can describe most aspects of redistricting, and we can look at how are the commission's maps performing compared to the maps that are produced by elected officials. California last cycle, there were endless efforts to influence the California Commission. The maps it produced were extremely fair, highly competitive, did a great job respecting communities of interest, improved minority representation in the state. So they were, a simultaneous improvement over their predecessors along basically every dimension of redistricting and representation. So I think parties will do what parties do, but I don't think that we have to therefore conclude that all of these institutions are permeable, that they'll be hijacked by partisan actors. I think if they're designed right, they can be resistant to those forces.
All right, well, since you have the floor, it's time for us to wrap up. We're going to ask all of our panelists to give us just some brief closing remarks about how to move forward, and particularly in the context of this report. And so we'll start with you, Nick.
I don't want to add too much more. I'll just say that of the ideas in the report, I'm more drawn to the judicial commission model, the redistricting model, than I am to what I think is more of a tweak instead of a more structural reform, which is switching to nonpartisan elections. I think elections themselves are the root of the problem here. And so I think the best reform is one that eliminates the root of the problem as opposed to opting for more cosmetic change, which is what I think the nonpartisan elections would be.
What about you, Miles? Any closing remarks?
Well, I'll echo Nick in saying that I think the report hits on some very, very good, significant reforms. There's no silver bullet for what ails our election process. I mean, I think we need to do things that get people to participate in much larger levels than they do now. I think we need to try to get money out of the process as much as we can. But these steps are really, really important. And I think that in the situation that we are in now, of the hyperpolarization and the assaults on our democracy, I think one of the things that we all have to do, regardless of our political or partisan perspective or philosophical perspective, is unite to support the basic fundamentals of our democracy from being undermined.
And Amber, any closing remarks or thoughts?
Sure. I think, again, we need to make sure that we incentivize the right behavior, and we do what we can to make sure that people that are running elections are putting voters first and operating with the utmost integrity. Whatever we can do to incentivize that, either from structural changes or ethical standards or other guardrails that might come about. I think we need to try to move in that direction because our democracy depends on it. Voters expect it, and voters frankly deserve it. They deserve to have a professional system and system that respects them in the voting process and is also directly accountable to them.
And Kevin, one of the main authors of this report, what are your closing remarks?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think, reform to make state election leadership, whether that's commission or individual, to make it nonpartisan, professional, and independent is needed. And it also can be part of fixing another problem we haven't raised here, which is excessive state legislative micromanagement of elections. I mean, state legislatures do not turn to the Highway Commission and say, the bridges need 10-foot long pieces of steel, not 8-foot long pieces of steel. And what they say is, you guys are the experts, make enough bridges and make them safe. If you don't, we'll hold you accountable. That's what legislatures should do with election officials. That's how democracy works elsewhere. And a reform package that makes the leadership nonpartisan can also give it greater authority and make clear that the election administration is responsible for implementation of the broad policy that's set by the legislature.
Well, this has been a great conversation. I learned a lot. I appreciate the chance to moderate this discussion. And for some final remarks, I'm going to turn it back over to Avery Davis Roberts of the Carter Center.
Thank you, Tia. Thank you so much for moderating today, and thank you to each of our panelists for joining us for this conversation. For those who want to delve more deeply into some of the ideas we discussed, we will be emailing you a copy of the report, or if you just have to know more right now, you can go and download the report at cartercenter.org/vote or electionreformers.org. You'll find it all there. Tons of great ideas in that report. We thank each of you for joining us today and for the lively engagement in the questions that you asked and all the comments in the chat. Until next time, stay safe, be well. Thank you.